Today's occurrence happens in the longest known cave in New Jersey. When a Boy Scout troop entered a cave to play a game under adult supervision, you'd think not much could go wrong. In fact, two of the boys in the group were brothers, and their father, who was a state trooper, was one of the leaders watching over everything. But as the game continued on, and more time passed, two things were abundantly clear. Kids can sometimes get lucky in the way that they're small enough to maneuver out of tight situations, and the two brothers would be going home without their father for reasons that didn't have to happen. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of Donald Weltner and Crooked Swamp Cave. On Saturday, March 27th, Boy Scout Troop 116 traveled to Crooked Swamp Cave in New Jersey. They all loaded onto a bus driven by their scout leader, 48-year-old Donald, who went by Don. The boys' ages ranged from 11 to 16, and pretty much everyone was excited to explore the cave. They even had a caving leader with over 30 years of experience for the trip. That was Jim Ewan. There were also two other adults in the group. When they made it to the cave, everyone looked at the maps of the cave. They discussed different parts and took time to go over the tougher areas and the areas they should stay away from. Then, everyone split into groups and began exploring. Well, everyone except for Jim, who had a bad cold and didn't feel well enough to go into the cave during the trip. Don took over since he was the overall scout leader, but Jim was the only actual experienced person in the group. About half of the boys in the group had visited Chauffeur's Cave previously, but that was the extent of everyone else's caving experience. Now, Crooked Swamp Cave is basically a horizontal network of passages a few feet below its entrances and 15 feet under the sinkhole entrance. It technically has 7 entrances, but one isn't usable. The morning went on pretty uneventfully, and soon everyone went outside for lunch. At some point during lunch, the idea of having a cave manhunt went around, and everyone was on board. The game would be played by sending 3 Boy Scouts into whatever entrance they chose, and the boys had to get lost and stay lost to avoid everyone else coming in to look for them after waiting for 10 minutes. Ice cream would be the prize for the winner. Don and his 2 sons, 11-year-old Roger and 14-year-old Christopher, were the first to hide. Around 2 p.m., they chose a part of the cave system that was connected by dotted lines on the map, an entrance south of Tree Root Cave. The entrance was about 16 inches high and 28 inches wide. Once they went through, the trio crawled on their hands and knees through tunnels that got low enough to have to worm their way through on their stomachs most of the time. After about an hour, they made it 75 feet or 23 meters into the cave and 16 feet below ground. Still trying to find a place to hide, Don went into a narrow body-sized crevice. It was barely wider than his shoulders. It was wider at the top due to a small ledge, but below the ledge, it was 7 to 8 inches wide. So Don tried to squeeze in head first, and on his way in, he slipped, and he fell into a keyhole-shaped crevice in the floor of the cave. Don tried to get himself out, and originally denied being stuck to his kids. Eventually, Roger and Christopher did start trying to help their dad out once they realized that he really did need help. But Don was 5 foot 11 inches tall and 160 pounds, so his kids weren't able to pull him out. In fact, since the only thing they could sort of reach was his feet, and Don's arms were pinned at his side, Don couldn't even help himself much either. Around 3:20 p.m., and reports differ on times from this point on, so this is pieced together in a way that makes the most sense. But a father to one of the other scouts went into the cave to look for Don and his boys. Everyone else had given up searching for them because they were getting cold, and they left the cave around the time Don found that crevice. They had all been waiting outside of the cave for about 20 minutes. Once the parent found Don, he admitted to being stuck, so that parent went to tell Jim, the experienced caver. Jim and the boys grabbed some rope and looped it around Don's feet before trying to pull him out. They tried that method for a while, but pulling didn't do much, so they switched tactics. Don's speech started slurring a bit, so they knew they needed to try something more effective to get him out. Around 4:20 p.m., one of the Boy Scouts braced Don's feet, and they actually managed to move him 9 to 12 inches. It seemed promising, until Don's pants got snagged in the groin area. By this point, Don was being affected more by hypothermia, with his speech getting a little bit more slurred. He was only wearing a long-sleeve shirt and pants with rubber-soled shoes. He did have a helmet on though, but there wasn't a light source mounted to it. He only had a handheld flashlight. The clothing situation wouldn't be super terrible if the cave was at its normal temperature of 56 degrees, but it was March and the weather was cooler. The cave wasn't very deep, and it was affected by the cool air outside, so it was colder inside than normal. The Boy Scout group decided to try one more thing, using a board to lever him up, but after spending a little time looking, they couldn't find one that would work. At that point, they realized they needed outside help if Don was going to get out. So from around 4:45 to 5:30 p.m., rescue organizations were contacted, including the Blue Ridge Rescue Squad and the National Cave Rescue Commission. The rescue squad contacted the New Jersey State Police, who arrived in force. Don had been on the force for 22 years and was a sergeant working in the Communications Bureau at Division Headquarters, so that was understandable. The police then notified the local fire and rescue squads around 6 o'clock. When the first rescuers arrived on scene, Don was still relatively alert and coherent. They brought heaters, floodlights, portable communications equipment, and generators for all of it. Pretty soon, over 150 rescuers were on scene, along with 9 geological engineers who were there to give advice. Crooked Swamp Cave had over 1,200 feet of surveyed passages. Most were low crawlways, but there were some very high and narrow vertical fissures. Moving between some of the entrances was extremely difficult and sometimes impossible. The walls of the passage were hazardous too because they had jagged protrusions coming out of the walls randomly. And the cave is made of limestone, so that adds another layer of difficulty to the rescue since it's a breathing cave that expands and contracts depending on conditions. At some point while Don was trapped, he had been talking to rescue workers and asked them to tell his wife that he would be home late. By 7:30 p.m., Don had become somewhat incoherent, so they decided heat was needed to warm him up. Rescuers tried to warm him by using gel packs, a sheet soaked in hot water bottles, a portable electric heater, and a portable hot generator that was used for telephone work in manholes. Unfortunately, nothing worked. Teams of rescuers were working from 2 ends of the cave to try and free Don. Some would be working by his legs, and others by his head, although it was difficult to reach his feet and impossible to reach his head, with the exception of a very small person. They had to try and reach his head from the tree root cave side. By 10 p.m., Don lost consciousness, and as the night continued on, the temperatures outside fell into the high 20s Fahrenheit, or around -2 Celsius. Several teams kept working and repeated rescue attempts from both ends, but nothing worked. They couldn't pull Don out by his feet, and they could only get within 2 feet of his head. They weren't using jackhammers, as it was too dangerous to do with a live victim. By 1 a.m. on Sunday, it was obvious that all efforts to stabilize Don by using heat didn't stop him from sliding into hypothermia. So again, they tried to pull him out, but that still didn't work. By 3 a.m., Don still hadn't woken up, and the last time they heard any sound from Don was about an hour prior when he was making a few grunts. They hadn't heard anything since. Still, an officer who was friends with Don, going back 25 years, said there wasn't much hope left, but they would continue working as though there was still a possibility of only hypothermia being the issue. By 6 a.m., a registered nurse was sent in to check on Don. She was able to get close enough to remove one of Don's boots, rip his pant leg up to the knee, and use a Doppler to try and detect a pulse. She checked on the outside of his foot, behind his knee, and at the instep, which is the part of the foot between the ball and the ankle. No sign of life was detected, so it was decided then that ordinary extraction wouldn't work, so the green light was given to use extraordinary measures. Paramedics believed that Don's brain and vital organs were still functioning, even though his arms and legs weren't showing signs of life due to how cold he was. They decided to drill and chip a 17-foot shaft in the hillside to Don. The plan was to send down a small person in a cage 2 feet from Don. They were supposed to chisel him free from there. There was even a helicopter on standby waiting to rush Don to a nearby hospital. The process was grueling and slow, but they worked around the clock. The thick layers of bedrock that surround and formed Crooked Swamp Cave kept hindering progress. 12 hours later, when they thought they made it to where they were aiming for, everyone realized that the shaft that was supposed to be intercepting the cave had missed by 10 to 12 feet. So instead of chipping 2 feet to dawn from that shaft, they had to drill and chip an 11-foot-long tunnel that was 2 feet square in width. So from about 6:30 p.m. Sunday to midnight on technically Monday, rescuers tried to widen the passage from the shaft to dawn. It wouldn't be until Monday evening that a harness was able to be placed around Don's chest. From there, they spent 6 hours pulling him, but were only able to move him 1 foot towards the shaft they created. They couldn't move him any more than that. It seemed like he was wedged between stones. Rescuers had a doctor from the hospital go down the shaft, and he declared Don dead at 10:45 p.m. With him being declared, they could switch removal tactics. So at midnight, now technically Tuesday, they decided to remove Don by quarrying. They brought in a hydraulic rock splitter, jackhammers, and explosives to remove Crooked Swamp Cave's eastern passages. By 2 a.m., they made it to where they were able to extract parts of the cave around Don in order to get him out. They had to blast, backhoe, and drill to free him, to the point where his remains sustained several further injuries. His remains were recovered at 11:40 p.m. on Tuesday, March 30th, 1982, 81 hours after becoming trapped in the cave. Don's brother Carl, who was also a scout leader, although I'm not sure that he was there the entire time or if he was even working this trip, but he stood silently in ankle-deep mud while Don's body was removed and placed in a waiting ambulance. Don was then transferred to the hospital for an autopsy. His wife was notified at their home 60 miles away, and she was surrounded by troopers when she was told the news. When Don was finally moved, it was reported that a piece of rock behind his right hip locked him in place. It's why they weren't able to pull him out. Even after they freed 3/4 of his body, they had to winch him out to completely free him. Officers on scene believed that Don dislodged the stone when he fell, and when he tried to move back, it would tighten, and if he moved forward, it loosened. So he wasn't able to really go anywhere. Which brings me to the point, after realizing he couldn't be pulled out, initially, everyone should have immediately focused on keeping Don warm and alive until they could come up with a solution. This isn't a dig at the rescuers. They did the best they could. Hindsight is 20/20. It's just important to point out that sometimes it's better to shift priorities to keep victims alive and maintaining a healthier state, if possible, so that you have time to have a victim to save. Although, allegedly, police officers working the scene believed Don was gone on Sunday before they even started drilling the shaft. That being said, Don was wedged at a right angle in a narrow passage with his head stuck in a crevice at a 30-degree downward angle. His arms were pinned, and he couldn't move forwards or backwards. So getting him out in a timely manner, given those conditions, not being able to access his head to provide food or water for a couple of days, I would say that the rescuers did their best. The doctor that pronounced him dead would go on to say that he could tell Don had been gone for quite some time before he pronounced him. And after his body was moved, they could see blood on the limestone boulder where his head was at, but they couldn't tell if he suffered an injury from a rock that fell on him when he initially became trapped, or if it was from stones that may have loosened and fallen while they were drilling and blasting the cave around him. It was reported he lost a lot of blood, which would explain part of why he deteriorated so quickly. Where Don was trapped hadn't been mapped or explored by anyone. The dotted lines on the map weren't indicating a real connection. They were showing a suspected or unconfirmed passageway where the location and dimensions weren't known. So it was believed by those who designed the map that there could be a path based on what they do know, but it hadn't been fully explored, let alone verified. And more specifically, that the possible connection may be difficult to navigate, blocked, or narrow. Now, at some point during the rescue, residents of Sussex County, which is where the cave is located, came out to help. Local paramedics, firemen, and highway workers were helping the professional cave rescuers and state police. But the town only had one firehouse, and residents would donate eggs, vegetables, and meat there, so 3 meals a day could be cooked and driven to the cave to feed the rescuers. There were only 1,600 residents in the county at the time, since it's a rural farming area, which shows how major this was. Now later on, Jim, the experienced caver who was sick, would suggest a few things that revealed factors that possibly led to this happening, and I'll just expand on them. The responsibility for being stuck initially falls on Don's shoulders for a few reasons. Earlier in the trip, Don struggled to get through a small passage and may have been trying to squeeze through this one to redeem himself. Like maybe he wanted to prove to himself and his sons, and maybe everyone else if he won, who knows, that he could still do what they could do, and maybe do it better, and that he could squeeze into tight spaces too. I've met plenty of people like that. You know who you are. But the game itself obviously played a major factor too, because Don wouldn't have been so competitive and determined to squeeze through if there wasn't a game involved. And more to the point, it's believed Don heard voices of the other scouts looking for them and could have believed he could squeeze through an area where there was no out because he thought he heard voices ahead. Then you have to remember, Don had been in exactly one cave before, on what I'm assuming was another Boy Scouts trip. So he didn't know tight passages could be dangerous and potentially fatal. It wasn't something that would have crossed his mind. And given the fact that he's described as being daring, this was the perfect storm. But an important note made by a caving organization that I should mention, the entire premise of their outing was wrong. Playing games in a cave would teach the boys, and possibly future cavers, that being daring and playing in caves is okay. They should have been taught caution and good judgment, although I think at the end of the day, they unfortunately learned that lesson another way. After the disaster, public access to the cave was restricted. The cave is on a preserve that's actually a marsh complex with several federally protected and endangered animals, so hunting there is not allowed. Visitors can only explore Crooked Swamp Cave by contacting the New Jersey Cave Conservancy and arranging a guided tour. You have to have experience spelunking, meaning this can't be the first cave you decide to try, and they prefer explorers have memberships in recognized caving organizations. The tour follows strict safety standards, so they expect you to be up to snuff, which is the right way to go. Limiting access rather than blasting the cave or permanently shutting it is the way to go in my opinion. Granted, they were able to remove Don so he could be put to rest, and maybe they would have done differently if he was trapped there permanently, but the way New Jersey chose to go following this disaster minimized the chances of something similar happening again there. It also ensures resources aren't stretched too thin because only low-risk types are permitted inside, with them needing to meet certain standards, and it's with a guide, which is different to those who decide to completely, permanently shut down caves. Follow or subscribe if you haven't already, and stay safe. I'll be back on Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.